Okay, Postmaster GS here with a new version of the StampFix app that allows you to rotate and crop scans of stamps, version 1.20. The previous version was 1.11. In terms of exactly what's new in version 1.20, it's not a lot different in terms of what the app will do, the underlying functions of the app. A lot of changes to the user interface, however. So what I thought I'd do is put together another quick video just showing you how things have changed and giving you just a quick look at how to do the basic things with the app. First off, in terms of what the old app looked like and why I decided to make some changes to it. This is version 1.11, which is the previous version. The window for the app is fairly small. It looks really small on the screen here because I have a pretty high resolution monitor that I'm running, but the reason it is this size is when I did this originally in version 1.0, I was concerned about folks having smaller screen resolutions running, and I didn't want to make it larger than could realistically be expected to run on their screens. There's a certain amount of fixed size that goes with one of these things. You can see on this one there's a row of buttons across the top, which means it's got to be at least a certain amount wide, or you can't have those buttons there, or you got to do away with some of the text, and it limits your options when you have to accommodate smaller screen sizes. And because of that, I didn't give users the option of resizing the window, because the moment you get into window resizing, you have to start coding around that to accommodate, what are you going to do if they make it smaller than the area you need for all the buttons to show up, for example. So I set it at a fixed size, and I kept that fixed size fairly small to accommodate lower screen resolutions. There's a downside to that, however. There's numerous settings that you use when using this app, and I was required to put those settings in several different places to accommodate the lack of real estate to work with. For example, the image adjustment settings were on this toolbar at the bottom here. The batch settings were over here on this little toolbar. There were threshold settings on a separate screen here, and interface settings on a separate screen there. And there's a couple downsides to that. One is when you're processing an image, sometimes you need to tweak the settings, and it was difficult to tweak the settings because they were in several different places. And the threshold settings, especially, that are key to getting an accurate result, were on a completely separate screen, so it wasn't really quick and user-friendly to be able to change your threshold settings as you were working. And more importantly, it wasn't always obvious where the settings were and exactly what they did. About 90% of the time when users would have a problem with the app, it would turn out that the problem was there was a setting that they didn't know was there, or that they had set wrong, or they'd never changed it from the default because they didn't know where it was. And so one of my goals with this version was to change the user interface in a way that all the settings are centralized, so that everything's right there on the screen, so that no user is stuck going, well, I didn't know that was there, I didn't know where that was, because it's all right there on one screen right in front of you. And so that when you're processing an image, if you need to tweak the settings, they're right there in front of you, and it's really easy to do. So the new version has a significantly larger screen when you first boot it up. You can see it's quite a bit larger than the old one. I hope that this new screen is not too large for people's screen resolutions. I've tested it out on a couple laptops that use a much smaller screen resolution than the gigantic screen I'm on right now, and it worked on both of those without wrapping off the screen, so hopefully it works for you. If it turns out it doesn't, if your screen resolution is too low, you can either up your screen resolution, you can roll back to version 1.11, but regardless, if you could shoot me a note and let me know, that way if I discover that a lot of users out there are having a problem, then I'll go back and do another revision that kind of moves some stuff around in an effort to make it smaller. It is also resizable now. You can click and drag and resize things. The limitation with that is because of this sidebar here on the left, you can only shrink it in the vertical so much. And that, if you're going to have a problem, that's where it's going to be, is if your screen resolution is too low, it will be too tall for your screen. But hopefully that's not a problem. The ability to resize it now gives you a lot larger workspace when you're working, and also you can actually blow it up really big. I can't go full screen because I'm recording the screen, but this is close to full screen on my monitor, and you can see there's quite a bit of real estate now to view the stamps as you're working on them. Most of the changes here are strictly to the user interface, and I'll step through exactly what those changes were and show you how things work. There was one bug fix that I'll point out. The only real substantive change here to the underlying stuff was one bug fix. There was a problem that discovered where if you were processing an image that was thin and long or tall, like this one, it would process correctly originally, but the moment that you did a change to it, it would get cut off. There was just a math error, so I had to go in and correct that math error. That's the only real bug fix that happened here. The other issue that I was hoping to, I won't say fix because it wasn't technically a bug, but feature to add was with regards to the metadata of the images, specifically the DPIs. For those who don't know, anytime you create a digital image, there's certain metadata that is included with the image. It's text information that is buried in the file that is useful for several purposes. For example, if a camera creates a digital image, usually it will include information on the camera, the lens, the focal length, very often geolocation data as to where the photo was taken, and it will include things like the resolution in terms of pixels and the DPI of the image. With a flatbed scanner like we commonly use in stamping, it will normally include the make and model of the scanner, the height and width of the image, and the DPI. That image has to be written to the file normally when it's created. That's the way it normally works. The software that this app uses to manipulate the images, well, it's the same software that loads the image, manipulates the image, and then saves the image. That software does not have the ability to either load or write metadata. So what was happening was anytime somebody loaded an image, let's say the image was 300 DPI, it got processed and then saved as a new file. That 300 DPI did not get written to the new file. It wasn't incorrect, it was simply blank. And when an image has blank DPI data, the number that shows up when you go to view the DPI depends on what you're viewing it in. For example, in Windows, if it sees a blank DPI, it puts in a value of 96 DPI. With Adobe products like Photoshop, it puts in 72 DPI. The image is not actually 96 or 72 DPI. It is the exact same DPI as the original source image was, but because it's blank, this default value gets thrown in there, and the only way to fix it is to have a piece of software, or there's websites that you can do it where you just load the image up, you manually type in 300 DPI, and it will reset that in the metadata to 300. So one of my goals with this version was to add that in. Now again, the software that I use to manipulate the images just doesn't have that function. It can't do it. So I was trying to find another piece of software to add to the back end of this that would read the DPI of the source image file, and then when it spit out an image on the back end, to write that DPI data to the output file. I was partially successful in that. I was able to get it where if you load a PNG file, it will save the DPI to the output file, regardless of whether you're saving it as a as a PNG or a JPEG or whatever. Because the issue isn't really on the writing end, it's on the reading end. I have yet to be able to get it to work with JPEGs, however. JPEG is a non-standard format. There are multiple ways in which the data is included in the metadata of JPEG files, and it really just depends on what the software or camera or scanner or whatever's creating the image. It really just depends on what they use in terms of a metadata format. And because it's not a standard format, that makes it very difficult to write software to read it, simply because you never know exactly what the structure of it is going to be. I'm still working on that. I hope with the next revision to have it working where the JPEG metadata gets transferred from the input file to the output file. But as of right now, it's not there, and it's not due to a lack of effort at this point. In the meantime, the PNG does work, so if you're using PNG files, the DPI data should get transferred over correctly. I recommend PNG anyway. It's a much better format and better quality. But I'm going to keep plugging away at that. All right, so on to exactly what the functions do here. You'll notice that a lot of the settings, all the settings have been moved to the front. The single image processing settings have now been grouped into this area at the top left of this sidebar. The batch image settings are all right here toward the bottom half. And then this one setting at the bottom with regards to resizing the images, that applies to both single and batch processing. A few additional changes. The threshold setting, there's no longer a separate menu for the threshold setting. It's now right here, and that's the only threshold setting there is. Previously, with version 1.11, there were two threshold settings. There was a white background setting and a black background setting. I've done away with the two defaults, and now there's just one default. All of these blanks have defaults. So if you change this value to something else and you want to save it as your default, you just hit settings, save default settings. Then if you need to reload your defaults, you just hit load defaults. However, doing away with the separate black and white threshold settings does have the potential to cause errors, because if you have a black threshold setting, which 100 would be a good black setting, and you attempt to load a white image, it can't load it because the threshold setting is just so incorrect that it can't process the file. So what I've done to avoid those types of errors is I've set it where if it detects that you are loading a white image but you're using a black background threshold, it will automatically flip that to a more white appropriate value. This value will never change. It is always 210 because it's hard coded in there. You can then change this as you need to, 225, whatever. It's simply hard coded in there to avoid generating an unnecessary error message and to accommodate for the fact that I've done away with the two default threshold settings. It also works going the other direction. If you have a 225, which is a white background setting, and you attempt to load a black background image, it will flip it back to a more black appropriate number. You can still change these numbers. You can still have your own defaults. I could say 75 default, and then if I change that back to 100 and I hit load default, boom, it's going to plop 75 back in there. One other big change here, the settings there used to be a reprocess button. So what you would do is you would change your settings and then hit reprocess. I've done away with the reprocess button so that now the moment you hit enter after typing something in here, it automatically reprocesses. So if I hit a 90-degree rotation adjustment, the moment I hit enter, it processes. What this does is it allows you to make changes a lot faster and make changes without having to hit the button, so that you can kind of tweak things without constantly having to click the button. You just hit enter once you're done typing the value in. Okay, the batch from folder, batch from files functions, those still work exactly the same way. So do the prefix and suffix and changing the output format. All of these are applicable to the batch processing. This function of changing the batch output location has not changed. It's now here on the front screen, and this is a function that I found people didn't quite understand, so I thought I'd explain it again. If this box is unchecked, the images that get saved out of this will go back to the same folder that the source files came from. That's a little bit dangerous because if you don't insert some sort of naming prefix or suffix, you could end up overwriting your original files with the output files, and you may want to do that, you may not. But the default is that it's going to save it back to the source folder. This checkbox being checked forces it to save to whatever location you've got set here. I normally just leave it at my desktop, that way I can see the images before I then go file them away in whatever folder I want to keep them in. And then this function that controls resizing the images in terms of pixels on output has not changed. What has changed, however, is the batch from image, which is the function that allows you to extract stamps from a single scan. So we'll pull one up here. Okay. And you'll notice now there's this sidebar on the right hand side that controls the settings for the batch from image function here. The threshold setting works very much like this one on the left hand side did. All you got to do is type in it and hit enter, and it will readjust the threshold settings. It doesn't do it as you type. You do have to hit enter for it to work. The tolerance setting controls how much what multipliers put on these boxes. It's useful for growing the boxes if you need to. For example, if the stamp is a dark stamp on a dark background, you may need to add a little more tolerance to get the box to completely enclose the stamp. More than likely you'll need to shrink it, because that's what happens when you get stamps that are too close on the scanner. Sometimes you have to shrink the green boxes to avoid the green box running into the neighbor stamp if they're too close together. The min and max bounding box sizes, this is another function I don't think people quite understood. These sizes don't refer to the stamps, they refer to the green boxes. When the software does the original processing, it draws boxes around a whole bunch of things. For example, if I drop this number down to 0, you can see that there were 580 boxes that were drawn on this page. Ideally, you need 4. You need 1 for each stamp, and right now we've got 580. To get rid of the excess boxes, that's what these sliders do. The min box, the moment you start moving it up, it will get rid of all the boxes that are smaller in either height or width than this number. Max box works the opposite way. It will get rid of boxes that are really large. So if I drop this down, it'll get rid of the larger boxes. These are now sliders. They don't change as you slide, but the moment you let off your mouse, it will reprocess. So I can drag this up, and you'll start seeing all of the smaller boxes go away until I finally get it to where there's only 4 boxes on the screen. If all your stamps are the same size, it works really easily. If they're not all the same size, sometimes you have to play with threshold adjustment and the min-max bounding box sizes to get the right number of boxes. But there's always a sweet spot. I have yet to have a scan that I couldn't get the right number of boxes on. Once you get the right number of boxes, if you hit extract to file, it's going to use your batch output settings to send those directly to file. 4 of 4 processed successfully. Let me drag them to where you can see them. There they are. Worked like a charm. The recalculate function here, I did not do away with this button, even though I did away with the reprocess button over here, primarily because I found myself still using it for one particular thing. The workspace is resizable, but you notice that the image does not resize when you drag the workspace to a different size. The way to get it to resize is just hit the recalculate button. It will then resize it to whatever you've dragged your screen to. And if I shrink it back down to get it all visible again, I need to hit recalculate again, and it will refit it to the screen. Edit individually. This used to be called naming in the old version, but I found myself doing much more than just naming on it, so I changed it to just to edit the stamps individually. There's also the zoom buttons, zoom in and zoom out. I'm not going to demonstrate those because when I'm recording the screen, it causes all sorts of problems to use that function. So edit individually will then take me to a separate screen that allows me to edit the individual threshold, naming, file extension, initial rotation, final rotation, and padding of each stamp. This looks very similar, and in fact it works exactly like the previous versions, but I wanted to point out one additional thing. In the previous versions, and in this one when you're using a certain size of the user interface, you still get 2 rows of stamps. Now with only 4 stamps, it's not obvious, but sometimes I will scan 75 or 80 stamps in one go, and it became a little bit of a pain because I would end up with two rows and 40 plus columns of stamps, and it became a little bit of a pain because you had to just scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll to scroll through all of them. Well, as with the original screen, that screen is also resizable. It will initially come up at whatever size this screen is on when you hit the Edit Individually button. So if I blow this up and I hit Edit Individually, you'll see that now instead of 2 rows, I get 3 rows. It will insert as many rows as it can based on your screen size. You'll rarely get more than 3 unless you're running a vertical monitor instead of a horizontal monitor. But it does allow you to fit a lot more on the screen at one time, so that if you're doing 70 or 80 images at one time, you're not constantly scrolling. You can probably get a good 20 stamps on the screen at once to edit your settings on. But other than that, it works exactly as it always did. So that's kind of a general overview here. Again, not a lot of changes to the way things function, really just more about changes to the user interface. I am confident there are probably still some bugs in there because this was a fairly major rewrite of a lot of things. If you run into any bugs, or you have any questions, or you don't understand how something works or why something works the way it does, feel free to let me know. If you go to my website where you can download this, there's a report button at the very bottom of the screen to send me an email, or you can catch me on one of the stamp forums and just post something in one of the threads there. And I will try to help you out as best as possible. Give it a try. I'm going to keep plugging away at the JPEG metadata problem, and if you have any suggestions or recommendations for additional improvements, let me know. Other than that, good luck with it, and let me know how it goes.